Welcome to Miss Pat's Story Time, school librarian for Man Middle School in San Diego. The first story we're going to read is The Secret in the Old Attic. It's a Nancy Drew mystery story. So this book was written in 1944. Here's a picture of part of the story. This book was written by Carolyn Keene, illustrated by Russell H. Tandy. The first chapter is a challenge. The Secret in the Old Attic. Chapter 1. This seems like a strange place to hunt for a clue, Nancy, but that is exactly what I've been asked to do. The girl's father, Carson Drew, a lawyer, gazed at the package of letters tied with blue ribbon, which he had taken from his pocket and laid on the dinner table. "What is the clue about?" asked Nancy, watching eagerly as he tried to untie the ribbon. "Some lost music?" "Music? What kind?" "Popular songs, I believe, which haven't been published yet," replied Mr. Drew. "This task isn't exactly to my liking. I understand these are love letters, and—" Nancy laughed. Her father was the outstanding attorney of River Heights and had won many difficult cases by his brilliant, clear thinking. It was humorous to see him working industriously at a ribbon knot to untie a bundle of love letters. The girl offered to do it for himself, and he looked relieved. "Please tell me more about the case," Nancy begged. "Maybe I can help you with it." "I believe you can," replied her father with a smile. He looked affectionately at the slim blue-eyed girl beside him. Mr. Drew was proud of his attractive and unusually talented daughter, who had gained a reputation of her own by solving several mysteries. She and her father had been very close since the death of Mrs. Drew a number of years before, and had come to depend on each other for advice and assistance in their problems. Mr. Drew realized that someday Nancy probably would marry and leave him, but he hoped that this would not happen for a long time. She had many friends, both boys and girls. Her special chums were Bess Marvin and Bess's cousin, a girl named George Fane. The boy who seemed to interest Nancy most, her father had noticed, was Ned Nickerson, now a student at Emerson College. "Dad, if you don't want to take the case of the missing music," Nancy said, her eyes sparkling, "then I'll be glad to. Tell me what to look for in these letters." "I don't know," her father replied. "The instructions were vague. This afternoon, while I was away from the office, an elderly man named Philip March called and left this package with my secretary. He asked that I look through the letters to see if there is any hint as to what might have become of certain songs." "Who composed them?" asked Nancy. "I don't know." Nancy had untied the ribbon and now handed the letters to her father. He pulled one from its envelope and read it hastily. "I don't find any clue here," the lawyer said a few moments later. "Read this, Nancy, and see what you make of it." His daughter eagerly scanned the letter. It had been written by a soldier named Phipp to his wife, Connie, 4 years before. "I don't see any clue either," Nancy said. "Do you suppose Phipp is a nickname for Philip, and he's Mr. March's son?" "Probably," agreed Mr. Drew, handing the other letters to his daughter. "I'm mighty embarrassed reading these. Love letters never were meant to be read by the outside world." Nancy respected her father's opinion, yet she felt that if Mr. March were a close relative of the writer, he would not have shown the letters to anyone unless he had good reason for doing so. Have you ever met Mr. March? She asked. I think not, but he may be a member of a family that lived on an estate up the river a few miles. It seems to me there is an interesting story connected with them, but I can't recall what it is. Well, we'll soon know about the letters. Mr. March is coming here this evening. Nancy was eager for the moment to arrive when the man would ring the doorbell. While she waited, she reread the letters, pausing at several lovely verses in them. Nowhere, however, could she find any clue to lost or hidden music. Do you suppose these verses are the words of the song? She mused. Maybe they're. Just then the doorbell rang, and Nancy hurried to admit the caller. He was an elderly, gray-haired gentleman of soldierly bearing. His clothes were somewhat torn, his shoes were polished, and his suit neatly pressed. He bowed politely to Nancy and introduced himself as Philip March. Oh, yes, my father is expecting you. Please come in, the girl invited. Nancy led the man into the living room where Carson Drew was waiting. When she started to leave, Mr. March invited her to stay and hear his story. He sank wearily into a chair. I owe you an apology, Mr. Drew, for asking for asking such a strange favor. He began in a tired voice. A feeling of desperation came over me this afternoon. On the spur of the moment, I decided to come to your office. You and your daughter have helped so many people. I thought you might give me some advice. Mr. March was very pale and ill at ease. To give him time to compose himself, Nancy offered to bring him a glass of water. This seemed to refresh him somewhat, and Mr. Drew then inquired kindly if the writer of the letters was someone close to him. Yes, he was my son, my only son, the caller said sadly. In fact, he was my only child. Like myself, he was a soldier, but he lost his life 4 years ago fighting in a foreign land. I'm sorry to hear that, said Mr. Drew sympathetically, and Nancy added a word of condolence. Phip, that's what my Philip called himself when he was a little boy, and the name stuck, Mr. March went on. Phip was married to a lovely girl, but she passed away soon after he did. Now all I have is little Susan. She is your grandchild? Asked Nancy. Yes, Susan is 6 years old, and I want to keep her with me, but... The old man closed his eyes as if to shut out an unpleasant picture. I face complete poverty and will lose Susan and my home unless Phip's music can be found and sold. Tell me more about the music, begged Nancy, touched by the man's story. Perhaps I should start by telling you of my family. The Marches have been proud, well-to-do people, several generations of us in River Heights. I'm not going to be the one to ask for charity. Phip wouldn't want me to. As Mr. March paused to take another drink of water, Carson Drew inquired how the lost music could bring him any money. The songs were never published, the caller replied, and they were very fine. He turned to Nancy. The kind of up-to-date music you young people like, but much better than a lot of it I hear. Nancy was interested at once. My son could not bring himself to take the songs to a publisher, for he was never quite satisfied with the work, Mr. March explained. Then, just before he became a soldier, Phip put the music away in some secret place. If it could only be found and sold, little Susan will be taken care of until she is grown up. Mr. March, what made you think there is a clue to the songs in these letters? Asked Nancy. already thinking of how she could help the little girl and her grandfather. Connie, Susan's mother, wrote to Phip, suggesting that he tell us where the music was. The boy was full of fun and replied that he'd give her a hint and she could look for it. Then, after a few more letters, at this point the old man bowed his head. No others came. There followed several moments of silence. Then Mr. Drew spoke. Mr. March, my daughter and I could not find a clue, but perhaps we can if we study the letters more thoroughly. Thank you, the elderly soldier murmured. I'll remember your kindness always. I'd never asked for your help for myself, only for Susan. Friends have been caring for her lately, but they're moving away and are bringing her back to me at the first of the week. I must do something very soon. Otherwise, Susan will be lost to me. Mr. March rose stiffly to his feet. He bowed to Nancy, shook hands with Mr. Drew, and started slowly toward the door. Midway across the room, he swayed slightly and grasped a corner of the piano for support. Mr. March, you're ill, Nancy cried, darting to his side. As she seized the man's arm, he slumped and collapsed in a faint onto a couch. When Nancy and her father failed to retrieve him, the girl ran for Hannah Gruen, their housekeeper. She could not restore Mr. March to consciousness either, so Mr. Drew called in Dr. Evans. How serious is it? The lawyer asked him as soon as the examination was over. Heart attack? Fortunately, no, replied the doctor. The man is simply undernourished. What he needs is a few days' complete rest and plenty of good, wholesome food. Let's keep him here, Dad, Nancy begged. Her father approved heartily, and he and the doctor carried the patient upstairs to the guest room. While Dr. Evans administered to him, Nancy and the housekeeper hurried to the kitchen to prepare food. I'll fix a bowl of broth, said Miss Gruen, bustling about. Make some toast, Nancy, she directed. Everyone in the house was so busy waiting on Mr. March that they failed to notice an uninformed messenger boy come up the steps of the front porch. Furthermore, they did not see a girl who hastened across the street and spoke to the boy before he had a chance to ring the doorbell. After making sure that the telegram he was about to deliver was for Nancy Drew, the mysterious stranger signed for it, tipped the boy, and pretended to enter the house. What she actually did was to wait on the porch until the messenger had disappeared down the street. Then she tiptoed away, tore open the sealed envelope, and read the communication by the light of the street lamp. I'll answer this myself, she smiled, a satisfied look on her face, and hastened away. That is the end of chapter 1.